Hello to everybody joining us. Welcome to this webinar. So the numbers are rising, so I'll just kind of give a brief overview and then I'll hand over to Heather and to Hope. So welcome to BU with Hope Virgo and Heather Widdows. My name is Eleanor Wolfe and I am the Student and Recent Graduate Engagement Manager for the Alumni Office here at the University of Birmingham. So this event tonight forms part of UAB Festival, which is a really exciting enrichment programme currently happening at the university for students. And this event will be recorded, so once something pops up, just please press continue. And it will be on the alumni YouTube channel in a few weeks' time. And I'll shortly hand over to Heather Widdows, who will be facilitating the conversation tonight, followed by a Q&A. So please submit any questions for Hope via the Q&A box, and we'll try and get to as many as possible. My colleague Jenny and I may ask you to read your questions loud. So if you would like to ask your questions live, just please put live and we'll come to you. But obviously only if you feel comfortable, absolutely no pressure if not. Before we begin, I just want to highlight some trigger warnings. This event will discuss mental health, eating disorders and disordered eatings. And my colleagues Erin and Sandev from Student Services are on the event and will be able to signpost to any internal and external resources. So thank you so much again for joining us for what is set to be a really interesting conversation. And I'll now hand over to Heather.
Thanks very much. Those of you who don't know me, I'm Heather Widdows. I'm Professor in the Philosophy Department and Pro-Vice Chancellor for Research, and my latest book, which is a couple of years ago now, is Perfect Me, and it's all about body image and pressures to be perfect. So I could not be happier than to host this webinar, and I'm just thrilled to have Hope here to speak about her work and her book. So Hope was our 2021's Alumni of the Year, and if you haven't read her book Stand Tall Little Girl and you are interested in any of this, go and read it. It's full of wonderful information as well as a very personal journey, completely inspirational, and I hope at some point we'll get to talk about her campaign Ditch the Scales. So we're going to try and do this in quite informally. We've got loads to say to each other and we're just going to try and talk about what we care about. So feel free to put comments in the chat or the Q&A, and we'll get to what we can, and we'll just take it as it goes. So welcome, Hope. Do you want to start by just saying a little bit about you and why you do this and what you care about?
Yeah, no, definitely. So yeah, thanks everyone for joining, and thanks so much for having me as well. So yeah, my name's Hope Virgo and I am a full-time author and mental health campaigner. So I basically kind of split my time between doing a lot of workshops in schools, focusing most of my time on eating disorders and exercise addiction and disordered eating, as well as doing a lot of work with the government, particularly again around eating disorders and particularly around issues around access to services and access to treatment too. So I've been doing this for probably about 4 or 5 years now. But the reason that I kind of chose to go down this route and to kind of quit my full-time kind of 9-to-5 job and to go freelance, which was very risky at the time, I felt, was I've had my own lived experience of an eating disorder. So developed it when I was about 12, 13 years old, was hospitalized at the age of 17 for a year, kind of came out of hospital and wasn't really kind of fully recovered, but just knew what I had to do to stay well. And as I kind of progressed through my own recovery journey, I began to see so much of this kind of stigma, particularly around eating disorders, this huge lack of understanding, these kind of misconceptions around eating disorders about you have to have a particular look to have an eating disorder or be a particular type of person. And I was getting so frustrated by the lack of support and the lack of urgency, but also those additional things kind of with eating disorders relating to kind of body image, relating to the kind of the impact of social media, the kind of wider government messaging on tackling obesity, that I decided that I had to do something about it and turn that kind of frustration into something else. And so, yeah, like I said, kind of quit my 9-to-5 job and just began speaking out about it, kind of writing about it and campaigning with the hope that at some point we'll get a lot more investment into services and treatment and people will really understand eating disorders and feel okay talking about them.
That's a wonderful start, Hope. So we've already got a question actually that speaks directly to your work, which is about, given that most people with eating disorders, at least very many, are not statistically underweight, given the BMI and the problems with that, something we can probably both talk about. But you know, the question is, why do you think people put so much focus on appearance as an indicator of an eating disorder? And you know, perhaps we can just bust that myth a little bit.
Yeah, no, definitely, and it's a really good question. And honestly, I don't know why we are still so obsessed with that particular image. But it's true that when you think of eating disorders kind of stereotypically, we all immediately, or the majority of people immediately, think of this kind of white teenage emaciated girl. And as we know with eating disorders, kind of statistically, only 6% of people with an eating disorder are underweight. And we know that actually they can present in all different body sizes, different kind of shapes and sizes. They affect people of all different genders, all different backgrounds. And actually, at the moment, we're seeing a lot of older people developing eating disorders as well. There's been a particular spike over the pandemic in men aged 35 to 44 years old developing eating disorders. So I think probably, if I'm honest, it goes kind of way back, kind of historically, to when people didn't really understand eating disorders and they fixated too much on the kind of refeeding aspect and also on kind of just judging someone based on what they looked like. And it became like an easy way to solve things. And I think the reason it's still going on now and being judged so much kind of like that is because there's a huge lack of kind of funding when it comes to eating disorder services. So services have to make a decision on that criteria. And then also, I think because a lot of eating disorders are quite new diagnosis, if that makes sense. So we have obviously had anorexia, kind of bulimia, binge eating disorder for quite a long time. But there's been a lot of new types of eating disorders, such as orthorexia, such as ARFID, where there hasn't been as much research done into them. And often those illnesses have still got a lot of stigma and are still not really understood as well. So yeah, a huge part of my campaigning is actually around trying to get rid of that BMI threshold and trying to get people to really understand it, so that, yeah, anyone can kind of access support and treatment regardless of what their weight is.
Yeah, so that's fascinating, and you know, and it's so interesting about the myths about only certain types of people have eating disorders, and only certain types of people have body image anxiety. So one of the things that, you know, I've been working on in my work is around just how extensive body image anxiety is, and you know, I talk about it as an epidemic, and the boys and men too. So anecdotally, lots of cosmetic surgeons are telling me that their biggest demographic post pandemic is middle-aged men, probably have never really spent as much time looking at themselves as they have in Zoom. So that's vastly increasing some of those worries around that. So I just wonder, I wonder if we could just talk a little bit more about the different types of people with eating disorders and how that's playing out. Because one of the things that I think may be going on in this is not taking it seriously, in thinking that, oh well, you know, it's quite normal to have some kind of disordered eating, and the way that we use diets, and that the focus on bodies and dissatisfaction with bodies is something that we just treat like we think there's something a little bit odd about somebody who's not unhappy with how they look in one way or another, and we do kind of friendship talk like that, and that's really so destructive going forward for what we're teaching and what we're ingraining with regards to how we think we want to have a relationship with our bodies. So I wonder if you just have something to say about the relationships we should be aiming at, and some of the things we should be doing.
Yeah, no, definitely. So I think yeah, I obviously totally agree with you, which is lucky. Yeah, and I do, something that I quite often talk about is the fact that we've kind of embedded this culture of eating disorders in our day-to-day, and I think it's definitely got worse during the pandemic, if I'm honest. Kind of, if you think back to last summer when we had the kind of June 21st kind of banded as this day of freedom, and as soon as they announced that roadmap, all over things like social media, people were talking about what diet they were going to go on, or how they were going to start restricting, or how they're going to shrink themselves to look a certain way, be a certain size. And I think because of those narratives we're telling ourselves, we've then also moved into this narrative that in order to be healthy, you have to be thin. And again, normalizing that kind of, which is unscientific in itself, but actually it just puts a lot of pressure on individuals. And then on top of that, you then also are seeing a lot of this pressure from society more broadly, linking to body image, these kind of modern societal ideals to kind of be a certain way, look a certain way. And if you don't look that way, you're not going to be happy, or you're not going to be successful. And what I see from a lot of the work that I do in schools, but also this is something that will be affecting kind of students and adults as well, is that people spend so much time on things like social media, kind of judging themselves against someone else, kind of comparing, contrasting, feeling the pressure from modern society. And so they leave this kind of, I don't know, like half an hour, however long it is on social media, feeling like there is something kind of categorically wrong with themselves that they have to then fix and change. And in society, we're constantly looking for like these quick fixes. We do it when we're shopping on Amazon, don't we? We all kind of want to get it the same day, even though we probably don't need it for a week or so, but we're looking for these quick fixes. And often that's presented to us in things like diet culture, kind of telling us if we just restrict, we'll get this kind of quick win. And the really scary thing with eating disorders is that a lot of those behaviors, whether it's calorie counting, whether it's kind of obsessive exercise, have now become so normalized that actually we don't often realize the detrimental impact of them. And you take something like calorie counting, for example, and we know that 25% of people who start calorie counting will develop an eating disorder. So it's not a harmless thing for people to be doing, but it is something that can have that kind of long-lasting impact on an individual as well. And I think what I've noticed over the pandemic is just the sheer number of people who are just functioning at a high level with an unhealthy relationship with food, with their body, with exercise. But because it's so normal, we just don't really question it. And then, like Heather said, it's like you then start to question those people who like their bodies, kind of wondering how they can like their bodies, how have they got to that space? And you're not really sure. So then we keep going back down that narrative around, oh, I'll just change that and fix it, and then I'll work myself out eventually.
That's absolutely fantastic. So everybody remember that, right? 25% of people who are calorie counting go on to develop an eating disorder. So the next time you're having a chat at the water cooler, once we all get back in the office, about the new diet, have a rethink about whether you really want to share that and whether that's really the behaviour we want to model. One of the things that I called out in my work as a philosopher is this kind of, if you can fix it, you'll be happier, and that's a really different way of being human than we used to have, and New Year's resolutions are really revealing and particularly scary. So the notion that if you're thinner, you'll be happier, you'll be better, that's now so embedded in our culture, and that's a massive change, and we haven't recognized how that happens. So if you go back not very long, if you say about, so I've used some diary extracts in my work from girls a century ago, and it's things like, I resolve to be a better daughter, I resolve to think before I speak, I will work on my character, I will learn a language. So that sense of who you were was about the skills you had and the roles you had, a very connected thing. It's about capabilities, and it's about, mother, daughter, teacher, healer, right? These are what we used to think were ourselves. There's something really strange gone on, and we haven't called it out, partly because it's happened bit by bit, and partly because it's mostly, up until very recently, been predominantly about girls and women, and we've never really taken that very seriously. But the sense that yourself is your body, and if you change your body, you'll change yourself. That's a phenomenal change, and we really don't understand quite how destructive it is. And the work that Hope is doing is really calling out some of that. And I think we really need to think about that sense that your body is malleable, that you can change it and fix yourself. Right? We know that's not true. Right? There's only a certain amount one can do with diet and exercise, and it's much less than we imagine. And the same is also true with cosmetic surgery. Right? So cosmetic surgery, surgeons will tell you, that they get red flags when they see patients that want to change themselves in fundamental ways, because actually our bodies are relatively static, and that's not something that we share and think about. So that's just me throwing my little bit of my philosophy into it. I want to go back to Hope and the social media, because it is really transforming some of our expectations. There's almost that sense of, if I haven't taken a selfie, I wasn't there, or I haven't taken a picture of my food, I didn't eat it. There's a real strange phenomenon going on. Where are we living? Are we living in virtually, or are we living in the real world? And in the pandemic, we've lived even more virtually, and how that's affecting our body image and pushing people to think that really quite destructive behaviour, again, come back to your words about normality, is normal. I just wonder if you would say a little bit about social media and how that's hitting our body image.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think, I do think, first, I guess social media can be positive. I just want, before anyone, kind of disagrees with everything we're saying, I think there can be some positives within it. But I think a lot of that's up to the individual, which I'm happy to kind of talk about in a minute as well. But I think from that kind of more negative aspect, we all know that when we're looking on social media that we're basically seeing someone else's highlight reel. Someone's probably edited that picture. We're not really showing the reality of it. In fact, actually, I posted a photo on my Instagram account earlier, and I took about 30 pictures until I was actually happy with the picture that I'd taken. And then even when I posted the final picture, I wasn't even that happy with it. It was basically just because I wanted to have some lunch and kind of get on with my day, and was like, this is ridiculous. Like, I shouldn't be spending my time doing this. But actually, for a lot of people, they will spend hours and hours and hours kind of finding that exact photo. And even though we all know that, and we all have those mantras we tell ourselves, when you're maybe having a challenging time, or maybe you're struggling slightly, you do sometimes feel like actually you do just go down that comparison route. And I think we all do it. And I think what's made it much harder over the pandemic is we see a lot of this kind of messaging also on social media, kind of, yes, telling us that if we're thin, then we'll be happier, or if we look a certain way, we'll be happier, but also a lot of kind of diet advice and fitness advice from a lot of these kind of wellness influencers. And whilst I don't think any of these individuals particularly mean to cause harm, I do think that a lot of that information that we are reading online can be quite toxic and also quite triggering, not only if you've had an eating disorder or you're in recovery, but actually for other people as well, to really start to question what they're doing with their bodies, where they're getting their self-worth from. And it's really difficult. I think it's interesting actually, because like from the work I do in schools, you speak to young people all the time and they know kind of how toxic it can be. They know what to do about social media. They know that it's not the realities of things, but actually so often when it's us in person, we just can't really kind of counteract that. And we still believe everything we're seeing. And I do think, like I said at the start, it's kind of finding a way as individuals that we can really take ownership of that. And so I know for me, I've had a bad day. I have a tendency to scroll on things like Instagram for hours and hours and kind of not really reading a lot of the content, but subconsciously you're kind of flooding yourself with all of it. And it starts to make you question everything you're doing. And then you then feel so much worse than before. And I think in that sense, again, like whilst we all know that, we have to be taking ownership of it, kind of creating our feeds in such a way, bringing in that time limit when we need to, kind of making sure that we're actually doing more stuff outside of social media than we are on social media. And even kind of calling ourselves out on, like Heather mentioned, it's funny, like we don't feel like unless we've taken a photo of it, it's happened. And you kind of go on a night out or go to a restaurant and you don't take a photo and you're like, oh my goodness, no one's going to know I was here. But actually we need to start, like, I guess, making the effort ourselves to just be like, actually, that's okay. Like not everyone needs to know everything that we're doing all the time.
No, that's absolutely right. It's a really interesting phenomenon about was I there if I didn't have the photograph. And there is the image-based culture thing is really interesting, and it's something that we need to do more work on, because we all know, right? Nobody's stupid. None of our young people are stupid. We're not stupid, right? We all know that nobody looks like their Instagram pictures. Right? We know that with our heads, but that doesn't actually change how the images hit our sense of self and our subconscious and our imaginings. So I talk a lot about the imagined self in my book, and I think that's so much of what's going on is connected to how we see ourselves in our heads and in our imaginings. We know that images cut through our ability to reason about them. So it's quite a long time ago now, but yes, I've been working on this field for a while. So there was a time when we were doing some campaigning around magazines labelling images to say they'd been doctored. And there were some places that moved this. It was primarily France and Australia, because they're a bit more feminist type countries when it comes to legislation. And the opposite happens to what those of us who were campaigning for it wanted. So what it turned out was, if you put a label on a magazine where it says something like along the lines of this model's legs have been lengthened and the cellulite removed and thinned, right? Instead of the person looking at that image and feeling, oh well, that's all right then because that's not real, the opposite happens. The label draws attention to the legs. So it's not about knowledge. It's about something about understanding how images cut through that. We see the images, we feed it into our imagined selves. So even though we know it, it doesn't stop us feeling bad about ourselves. And that's something that we haven't come to terms with. We don't quite know what to do with that, and we haven't lived in a visual culture before. We've always lived in a text-based culture, And social media is fundamentally transforming how we communicate and how we receive information and how we share information. So there's something there that we really need to think differently. And I don't have the answer, but I do know that there's questions there that we it's not just about knowledge, it's also something about how we manage images that we need to think about. But your point about how much time we spend on social media and how that it impacts on us is so true. I mean, every psychological study will tell you the longer you spend on various types of sites, not as you say, not all of it's bad, there's lots of positive there, but certain types of sites, they will impact upon you in certain kinds of images, and the images you see are all of a type. So even when you see very diverse, supposedly diverse images, they're not really diverse. They're usually, you know, so there's four characteristics of the beauty ideal: thin, firm, smooth and young. Nearly all of our campaigns about diversity only attack one of those. So in fact, you really, almost every image makes it harder to think differently. Yeah, so sorry, got a little bit carried away on my philosophy. We have we have some questions in the chat. I don't know if so I'll just ping through. The first one is about Hope, could you please give us some details about some of the lesser known eating disorders? So you listed a few of them.
Yeah, no, definitely. So I guess firstly, just an interesting stat. I'm kind of, for some reason I'm in a stat heavy mood tonight. We know that actually when we're looking at eating disorders, only 8% of people have anorexia. So I think, again, like whilst a lot of us probably thought that was the most common type of eating disorder, it's actually up there as being the least common type as well. So other types of eating disorders include binge eating disorder, include bulimia, and bulimia can also be characterized as not just purging kind of through making yourself sick, but also purging through exercise as well. The DSM criteria on the NHS doesn't class exercise addiction as an eating disorder, but actually there's a lot of crossovers between kind of exercise addiction and eating disorders, and particularly kind of people who develop things like orthorexia, which is an obsession with healthy eating, to the extent that in some cases people will end up cutting out a lot of their day-to-day food because they're not sure whether it's healthy or not. Things like orthorexia are quite difficult to get a diagnosis because on the outside, I've heard experiences of people going to their GP and the GP maybe congratulating them on kind of how much exercise they're doing or kind of how healthy their diet is. But again, it's a difficult one, and it's something that actually, if you have had a diagnosis of something like that, you have to keep going back to the GP. There's also a type of eating disorder called ARFID, so avoidant food restrictive disorder. So when, again, you kind of avoid certain food groups, again, kind of making your foods quite narrow in what you can have and what you can't have as well. And then also another one, so atypical anorexia, which is someone who has anorexia, but who's in a larger body. That is a very, very contested diagnosis. And I would agree, actually, I don't think it's the right diagnosis to give. We know that eating disorders are such competitive illnesses, and quite often with things like anorexia, it carries a lot of shame already, but then that competitive element kind of really amplifies a lot of that shame, and people often feel really guilty and that they're not deserving enough if they get given a diagnosis of atypical anorexia instead of straight anorexia. So there are some people who are kind of doing work at the moment to try and challenge that as a type of diagnosis as well. But I do think, and we kind of touched on this like quite near the start of the session, that a lot of people have that disordered eating, and a lot of the time I think it crosses over into an eating disorder. But it's important, I think, as soon as you start to see any kind of red flags in yourself or in others, that actually that's when you have that initial conversation and kind of start to bring all of this stuff out into the open, because we know with all eating disorders, they really thrive in that secrecy.
Thanks, Hope. That's I mean, the sort of clean eating is such a difficult one because it's a way to hide it, because so often it's praised and felt well, and you know, so compared to so many eating disorders where shame and guilt is attached. I'll come back to shame and guilt in a minute, but let's do a few more of these questions, right? So we've got another one from somebody who said that their eating has become much more disordered during the pandemic. You do speak for very many of us, and it's absolutely the case. Do you have any tips for a healthier relationship with food?
Yeah, good question again. I think firstly for me, I'd always question where my belief system had come from. And what I mean by that is, so during the pandemic, you might have created various beliefs around certain foods. You might have been using food as a way to numb a lot of emotion. And as soon as food starts to serve a purpose in your life, that then again is kind of that red flag that maybe something's not quite right. So firstly, yeah, kind of writing down all your belief systems and starting to kind of break down, like, are you cutting out certain foods? Are you overeating certain foods? And then try and actually slowly work your way through those to kind of challenge them. I think having routine and structure can be really, really helpful. I know there'll probably be some people here who have kind of different opinions on things like kind of meal plans and things like that. And I know personally, like, going on a meal plan really, really helped me, but it also caused me to become extremely institutionalized for a number of years after leaving treatment. But actually having that routine and structure can be really, really helpful for a lot of us. Again, with kind of food, and I think kind of getting it when it becomes quite erratic, it is normally because there's other things going on in life. We know that eating disorders aren't really about food, but it's a vehicle to kind of express, the food is a vehicle to express that emotion, to kind of numb things that are going on, to maybe act as a distraction, to maybe give you that sense of certainty. So as soon as you start to see that, actually, you can look at other factors that maybe are in your control, other things that you can then focus your time on. And then I think another thing that's really important is kind of making sure that when you are having food, particularly I think during the pandemic, because a lot of us have probably been at home all the time, kind of sitting at our desks all day, kind of working and eating at our desks and not really giving ourselves those breaks. We need to make sure that actually we are emotionally connecting with people at meal times. If you have a look at the Brazilian guidance around kind of public health and particularly around eating, one of their key recommendations is to make sure that actually meal times have that emotional connection. So making sure, I know you probably can't do it for every single meal time, but actually maybe having an evening meal with other people, kind of making those memories, having that kind of space where you're talking to people and you're not just focusing on the food, can also be really, really helpful too.
Yeah, absolutely. And these secrecy things really is really characteristic of some of this, and indeed about very many other aspects of body image concern, like the secret. So you know, so selfie taking is an interesting one. So sometimes selfie taking can be quite a communal and bonding act. Like nearly everything in the beauty space, right? It's not all bad or all good. A lot of it is context and how it's done. You know, so there's a huge difference between, you know, a group of teenage girls taking a selfie in the evening after they've messed about with makeup for an hour and played with stuff and it's really fun, to being on their own and spending 6 hours getting it right, putting it up if the likes don't come, taking it down again. Yeah, and that's why one of the reasons why the beauty space and body image space is really interesting, right? Because it's not something that we don't want not to care about our appearance. Right, there's something very social and collective about caring about our appearance. It's doing it to the right amount in the right way, and it's much more difficult than many other areas. So one thing I want to come back to is guilt and shame. So it's one of the indicators that something moral is going on, is guilt and shame, because those are moral emotions, and body shaming is one of the few forms of discrimination that we have normalised and that we still normalise. And so in my own work, I've got Everyday Lookism campaign, and it's really about body shaming and kicking back against that in the same way as we've kicked back against sexism and racism. And I do think there's something about collective action here that's not about individuals, but absolutely about how we culturally address some of this. Some of it is so powerful that we don't need to put more pressures on individuals, but we can collectively kick back against some of this. So anytime you feel guilt or shame, there's usually a sign that there's something social going on. So I guess if I wanted to leave you with one message from this webinar, it would be, please don't feel more pressure about what you do or don't do with your own body. There's so much pressure out there that you shouldn't feel, oh, I should do more of this or less of that. You should give yourself a little bit of a break and try and be more relaxed in this space. One thing that writing the book did for me was I just worried much less about what I did and didn't do, and thought much more about the culture and the messages that I was giving, you know, to my daughter and my work with schools, and it made me much more forgiving of my own physical failures or perceived failures. So that would be my one message. Loads more questions. Hope everybody wants to ask you things. Do we have anybody who wants to ask in person? Perhaps you could Caitlin, are you willing to come on and ask your question?
Yeah, that's fine. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My question was whether you thought it was helpful or distracting when high-profile individuals share their experiences of eating disorders. I was thinking, I've just recently watched the Freddie Flintoff documentary about his bulimia, Chris Eccleston discussing in his autobiography about anorexia, and also just popped into my head as well, recently watched the Frankie Dettori documentary, talking about his basically a lifelong dysfunctional relationship with food to enable him to do his job. I was wondering whether you think that's helpful, or actually do those kind of experiences inadvertently glamorize eating disorders, because those individuals are all still functioning at really high levels, despite often very long-term dysfunctional relationships with food.
Yeah, really good question, and I'm really pleased that you said what you said at the end of the question as well, because then I don't feel like I'm coming in quite as hard. So I honestly really struggled with the Freddie Flintoff documentary. I thought it was really interesting, and I thought it was really good because it was someone high profile, like you said. It was a male talking about an eating disorder, and it was also talking about another aspect of bulimia as well, kind of linking in obviously the binging and the purging, but also the exercise obsession as well. My struggle with it, which you've touched on already, was that he is extremely successful and he's still functioning at a high level with an eating disorder, which is something that I don't think is right to talk about. I think for me, I am always really aware of kind of getting across that message that actually, yes, there are a lot of people functioning at a high level with an eating disorder, but actually a lot of those individuals are probably not that happy. They're probably always thinking about food. They've probably got bad breath, maybe. They're probably tired all the time. They're probably not really sleeping. So there's all of these negative factors. And for some reason, when we're kind of doing, I don't know, whether it's Freddie Flintoff, whether it's Chris Eccleston, it's like we don't talk about those negative and really horrible physical side effects and the mental side effects as well of having an eating disorder. So I don't think it gives that kind of accurate picture of actually what it's like, but perhaps kind of normalizes again that kind of functioning at a high level with it. So yeah, whilst I think it's great because we are talking about it more, I don't think it's always being done in the right way.
I'm going to fire a few more at you, Hope, because there's loads coming in. One's a very practical one about how do you feel about food showing calories, and how do you overcome that?
Good question. So I personally don't agree with food having calorie labels on, and I think it's getting more and more frustrating now, because pretty much anytime you go into any shop, it's just plastered kind of left, right and center. I think when you've had an eating disorder or an unhealthy relationship with food, or even calorie counted, it's really difficult to ignore those kind of numbers on things and not be drawn to look at them. For me, it was always about trying to kind of challenge that, and to sometimes maybe going deliberately against the kind of eating disorder thinking and choosing the thing that had the higher calories, because then it was just kind of making a point that I was saying yes to recovery and no to the eating disorder. But a lot of that took a lot of time. I think something that's really important is to be educating ourselves on calories, actually not on the amount of calories in food, but actually firstly the dangers of calorie counting, and then secondly the fact that actually you cannot judge how healthy food is by the amount of calories in it. You look at some foods that have a lower calorific content than other foods, but actually the higher calorific content could be the thing that's more healthy, that's kind of better for you potentially. So yeah, I think it for me was always that kind of educational piece, and then also making sure that if I was kind of going down that route, that I was understanding why I was tempted to go back down it. So for me, when I felt tempted to do it again, it was because there was a bit of uncertainty. I might have had stuff going on. So again, the eating disorder and the kind of calorie counting behaviors were trying to pull me in to serve that purpose. And as soon as I began to kind of understand that, again, it helps you to just feel much more in control of that situation yourself, and actually think I can kind of start to distance myself from it too. So yeah, I guess that's kind of like a snapshot overview.
Yeah, it's like the craziness that so many things that say diet on them and have less calories are just full of sugar instead of, very healthy fats that builds your brain and everything else. And a bit like my model and her legs, when it attracts you, they have unintended consequences. It's kind of these public health messages that are meant well, but are not thought through very well about what actually happens. A few more questions. So I've got one from somebody who is just been reading a research paper that concluded that an over-evaluation of shape and weight was the underpinning psychopathy of eating disorders. Is this true?
I personally don't think so. So I think eating disorders are so much more complicated than that. And we know they're not really about kind of particular weights. And I think actually some of the research that's been done probably historically has been so fixated on that perhaps it kind of makes everyone think eating disorders are a bit of a vanity project. I do think though that when you have an eating disorder, and we know, and there'll probably be people on this who know better than I do, but like our brain chemistry does change. And then you do get much more preoccupied with your body shape. And also then in some cases, your body image does also then distort as well. And then the preoccupation becomes kind of even greater at that point as well. But I think by kind of just focusing on that, it does dismiss a lot of other issues that come up with eating disorders. And I do also think it's been quite interesting. So my eating disorder stemmed originally from childhood sexual abuse, and also kind of quite a dysfunctional kind of family relationships as well. And kind of, like I said at the start, kind of wanting to change certain factors within it. And it wasn't about the shape or the weight, but then the shape aspect and the weight aspect became so intrinsic to it when it kind of progressed. But then nowadays, when we look at eating disorders, we are seeing a lot more people developing eating disorders that do link kind of to the shape and weight. So I think it's probably, in short, something that's changed over time as well. But by just thinking about that, it does simplify it a bit too much.
Yeah, there's something in the same question about asking about perfectionism as well, which we know is an increasing trend as well. So, I mean, I think it's not surprising that the shape and weight as a driver has increased at the same time as our visual culture has absolutely transformed. So if you think about the perfectionist culture, so I'm going to get my statistics slightly wrong here, but we do know that girls as young as 3 or 4 make judgments about character based on silhouette and body size, which is particularly scary. And we also know that by the time girls reach the age that they're coming to university, over 90% feel pressures to be perfect at least some of the time. That's an extraordinary thing, to feel a pressure to be perfect. No human being is perfect, and yet we routinely feel this, and that's something that we really need to push back on in our culture, because it stops us doing all kinds of things. It stops us exercising. It stops particularly young women speaking. The fact that we all know what a bad hair day is actually a problem, because it means that therefore you don't go out and you don't do things. So there's a real pushback we need to do around this. Loads more questions coming in. Thoughts of your trend on people posting sometimes graphic images of themselves at a low weight to celebrate their progress in recovery?
Appalling, shouldn't be done.
I'm with you there.
Yep. I think from an eating disorder perspective, it can be very triggering for people. It often then takes us back, I guess, to that first question, doesn't it? That you have to have a certain look to have an eating disorder, which we know is wrong. And not only that, but from kind of, I guess, for other people, it often will stop them reaching out for support if they don't feel like they've ever got to that state as well. So yeah, I don't agree with the before and after shots at all. And I think whilst we are seeing some progress online with them kind of blurring out images, we know that because eating disorders are very competitive, people will still also look at those images too. So I think it needs to be taken kind of one step further than that as well.
Yeah, my personal view, I totally agree with everything you said, and I would take off every before and after for cosmetic surgery, for weight loss journeys, for eating disorders. They are all dreadful, and they all have this notion that you just need to change yourself to sort something out, and it's just terrible. I hope Facebook or Meta or whatever it's now called is listening. Get rid of all the before and after pictures on Facebook, on Instagram, and everywhere else. So I see Imogen has come onto the screen. So Imogen is president of BEAT, who many of you will know as an eating disorder charity. Imogen, can I bring you in to ask your question of hope?
Yeah, of course. Hi.
Hey.
Hi. So I was just wondering, what do you think that both sort of the university itself and also us as a society, BEAT UIB, can do more of to help those students struggling with disordered eating and eating disorders?
Yeah, so I guess as a society, I don't know 100% what your kind of role and remit is, But I guess it would be about bringing these conversations so much more out into the open. I think quite a lot of the time we still shy away from talking about any of this sort of stuff, and people don't have the knowledge or the education, and they think that they only can be experts if they talk about things, when actually they don't need to be an expert to talk about eating disorders. So I think it's probably about empowering university students to spot the signs in their friends and then know how to have a conversation, but also to spot the signs in themselves as well, and getting people to really understand what their relationship with food is like. It might be about looking at what is on the university intranet for eating disorders, actually making sure that it's up to date, that the stats are up to date, but also making sure there is, again, the right signposting available for people, so they know where to go to for that additional support. And I think particularly with a university, it might be looking at actually what support there is. So whether there is some sort of peer support that can be set up. I think, again, we know that whilst peer support can be quite challenging for some people, it can also be really helpful to some extent. And then on the other thing with the university as well is actually educating kind of staff on eating disorders as well, and getting them to understand actually how to talk about stuff with students, kind of where to go to if they're worried about someone. I think particularly that kind of awareness aspect. I do a lot of work actually with mainly universities in London and Bristol actually, and in both those cases kind of running those sessions and workshops for kind of tutors, but also for students, so that they have that real concrete understanding of what an eating disorder is, what signs to look out for, and these are the practical things that they can be doing as a university, as students to each other, to really support those people as well.
Thanks, Hope, and thanks, Imogen. We should also thank you for the support you've given to hosting this debate, and we're really pleased with all the work you do. One of the things we might do at Birmingham is we might decide to be the community where we, change the culture around body shaming. We might just stop making it okay to say negative things about anybody else's body for any reason, right? Or no matter what. So that could be something that we could choose to do as a community. A whole load of more things. Hope that everybody wants to talk to you on this. So you talked earlier about making meal times social and emotional. So there's a question about what do you do with the people who don't live with friends or family and can't have that bonding experience, which I guess particularly important in the pandemic when we've been more isolated.
Yeah, no, definitely, and a really good question. So I think maybe trying to find people that you can connect with over meal times. So whether that's kind of having a phone call with someone whilst you're eating something, or maybe Zooming someone if you feel able to eat in front of someone else as well, having that emotional connection in that sense. It might be kind of taking yourself out to a restaurant and having food there, or at lunchtime going and sitting in a cafe for an hour over your lunch break, having a sandwich, whatever you want to have for lunch, and then kind of, I guess, experiencing kind of the whole world around you as well. And then I think if you're, as a side, I guess, if you're really struggling with those meal times and feeling really isolated, it's about thinking about what other distractions can you put in place around them. So it might be you kind of sit down, have a meal, and then maybe you go and watch TV for a bit, or you sit down, have a meal, and maybe you ring someone straight afterwards. But I think always important, whether you're living on your own or living with others, or you're a student or a tutor, kind of whatever your role is, that actually you're making the effort to cook for yourself properly and giving yourself that space to kind of sit down and enjoy something away from your screen for an hour or so every single day.
Thanks, Hope. There's a real sense in which it's about changing how you eat and the context and then the connotations of it as well. Is that would that be a reasonable interpretation? Right, some more. You've got some really impossible questions to answer in the chat. So one of them, and I don't think you should feel tempted to answer this because I think it might be an impossible one, but do you think eating disorders are largely caused by biological or environmental and cultural factors? So we can both have a little stab, but if we knew exactly, we'd be able to sort things more easily.
Yeah, no, definitely. So we do, I guess we know that eating disorders are kind of biological illnesses and they're brain-based illnesses. And there is a lot of research being done at the moment looking at the genetics. So there's an organisation called EGI, who are based out of King's College London, who are doing, a lot of research on the genetic aspects. I personally think that it's a combination of genetics, being predisposed to it, and then potentially something happening in your environment, which then triggers the eating disorder behaviors to start, which is why I think, again, when we're looking at things like calorie counting or I don't know, comparisons on social media, you could have the genetic predisposition for an eating disorder, and then you start calorie counting, and that then triggers you to go on to develop an eating disorder. But regardless of if you've got that genetic predisposition or you've started to develop an eating disorder, it's really important to remember that every single person with an eating disorder can fully recover. And that's something that we have to always hold on to when you're in that kind of road to recovery as well.
That's absolutely right, because there is another myth. We were doing a bit of myth busting at the beginning, but there is a myth out there that you never recover from certain eating disorders, and that is just categorically not the case. It is the case for a small number of people, but absolutely not categorical. So everybody remember that bit too. I'm going to just say a tiny bit on the biological versus culture. So you know, as Hope says, we are definitely understanding a little bit more about brain chemistry and genetics and how that feeds into it. But there is also has to be some cultural elements in the rise across demographics, the rise across cultures, which brings us to another question in the chat about different demographics, and I'm not sure if I'll just flick through it, but whether it's true limited to certain demographics, or whether BAME population in the UK is struggling. I have some figures on that, but I hope you go for it.
Yeah, so again, I think it is the research shows that it's harder for people from the BAME community to get support, purely because of the myths and the stereotypes around eating disorders. And often kind of culturally, sometimes people find it harder to speak up about it. But over the pandemic, we did see a huge increase actually in people, the BAME community really struggling with eating disorders. I think it was kind of over 200% kind of increase rate between admissions from 2017 right through to 2020, which was a higher increase than we saw in white people. But again, because of the lack of research, the lack of services out there, it does feel sometimes like it's impossible for people to get that additional support.
Yeah, so my research completely, but like looking globally, eating disorders are rising across the globe, across ethnicities, across demographics, and so you know, somebody like Susan Bordeaux, who wrote some of the great sociology, and it talks about the kind of the starving white girl stereotype as A, it's a stereotype, and B, it's the canary in the mine. Places, there's all kinds of myths, and it speaks to exactly what Hope said about it's harder to get treatment as a BAME person. That's partly because there's this myth about, you know, certain demographics prefer bigger women. It's just not true. You look at the most recent research coming out of places like South Africa, and you'll find that the ideal has converged on that thinner ideal with paler skin tone. There's a real global movement here, and all of it is tracking in a way which means that body image anxiety is increasing, and we are seeing more unhealthy relationships to bodies and food. So another one to bust the myth on. It's just not true. Let me see if I can find some more. Are we aware of any attempts to change the guidance of the NHS, the NHS for weight loss? I was shocked when I went down to download the NHS weight loss plan and found it was very focused on calorie intake and calorie counting.
Yeah, so good, really good, another good question. I am actually currently working with the new PHE. So I was working with Public Health England beforehand, and they've merged into the official health office or something. So currently working with them to try and change this. The problem is with a lot of these things is there is a huge amount of reluctance to change things. And I think particularly following the government's obesity strategy, which came out last summer, which had a huge focus on things like calorie counting, it means that also it kind of adds another layer of complication to trying to challenge this stuff, because there's a huge amount of education that needs to be done. And I think often they're looking for that quick fix and that quick solution to things without really taking the time to understand it. I do think that we need to be looking so much more at people's behavior and people's real understanding of food, and again, why they're choosing that certain food groups. And personally, I think just cutting, I don't know, either putting calories on something or cutting the amount of sugar in something, it doesn't actually change that behavior. There needs to be a lot more work done in that space as well. So yeah, definitely something that I'm kind of working on at the moment, but honestly, it's taking quite a long time to get a lot of those points across.
Yeah, so we just need to help Hope and cheer her on in this. It's really hard to change some of those views, and they are so damaging. So we had a chief medical officer not very long ago talk about a war on fat, which is a terrible thing to do, right? Inducing shame and guilt. How can you have a war on fat without having a war on you know, your own self? You know, all of this language is actually truly debilitating. Likewise, why are we measuring school kids? Terrible thing to do. It does nothing to address any unhealthiness. All it does is induce shame and guilt and increase body image awareness and dissatisfaction. So, you know, don't let your kids be measured. Don't think about BMI. Hope hasn't talked yet, but I hope she'll get a chance to about her ditch the scales. But it's a dreadful, debilitating, terrible thing to do. It always was. But in a visual culture where we really increasingly think our bodies are ourselves, it's a terrible idea. So let's push back on this everywhere we can. Hope, do you want to just before, I mean, there's loads more questions, but I do want you to get a chance to talk about your campaigning before we finish. So should we just do that before I move to some more of the questions?
Yeah, sure. I'll try and keep it concise. So yeah, so have been campaigning for the last 2.5 years. Originally kind of starting off to try and scrap BMI when it came to someone getting a diagnosis of an eating disorder. And then over the last kind of year have progressed that to be much more around kind of education, making sure that all frontline staff have an education of eating disorders, looking at issues around funding. Again, I mentioned at the start that eating disorder services are just massively underfunded and nowhere near meeting kind of like the demand that we need. And because of that, it means that people aren't getting support because of their BMI, often being turned away. And in quite a lot of situations that we're hearing about at the moment, actually people are losing their lives because they're not getting the support they need when they need it. And it's rather frustrating. I feel like you probably caught me on a more frustrating day with it. There's been another report that came out this afternoon in Manchester following the death of someone recently who died of anorexia, and actually comparing all of the recommendations in that to the recommendations that came out following the PHSO report in 2008. Nothing has actually been implemented or changed from a funding aspect. And I think one of the things that makes it so difficult is a lot of the time when you're talking about eating disorders, people do kind of fixate on them being a children's issue, not an adult's issue. So then again, the funding might go more into children's, or they kind of justify the fact they're not putting money into adult services because they're putting it into children's services, when actually we know that it covers like the entire life range for people as well. So yeah, the campaign has got a lot of signatures, so over 100,000, and I've posted a link to the petition in the chat. So do be amazing if you could have a look at it and sign it. Most recently with it, back in November, I launched an economics report, which actually I did with Ernst & Young, which showed that eating disorders are currently costing the UK between £9.4 billion a year and £11.4 billion a year on things like loss of earnings, loss of life, kind of carers costs, everything like that. And the plan was, following the back of that, to really push for a proper strategy around eating disorders. Obviously, we had that commitment made when we hosted a kind of parliamentary event, but nothing's really progressed further from it. So at the moment, working kind of to try and kind of keep that on the agenda and keep that kind of urgency up as well. And at the start of March, we'll be launching kind of the next phase of this, which will be really calling on that immediate action. So it would be amazing, again, if you could kind of keep a lookout for that kind of, yeah, if you're particularly interested in campaigning or you've got your own experience that you want to share, by all means, please do feel free to kind of get in touch directly as well. Because I do think this stuff will only change if people really start making noise about it and coming together. And I think the thing with eating disorders is historically people haven't really worked that well together. And the way to change this is for everyone to come together and really kind of champion this.
That's absolutely right. Coming together, culture change, less individual beating up on yourself, more culture change. There's loads of really interesting links in the chat, and they'll go when we turn off. So please go and look at the chat. Hope's petition is up there. My campaign is up there. More of Hope's stuff is up there. So make sure you go to those links and you click on them so you've got the stuff before we stop. A couple more quick things. We've got something about the language used to describe food as triggering, indulgent, cheat meal. I've had loads of this in my book because it's all about, you know, naughty pieces of cake, or oh, I've been good today. These are all moral judgments. definitely needs to move away. I hope. I don't know if we want to add something about that.
Yeah, just echo that. We need to stop labeling food as good and bad. Like it's food at the end of the day, and it keeps us alive, and we need it. And I think, again, being very mindful of those conversations around others. Like, yes, we need to be calling ourselves out on it, but if you feel the need to comment on what someone else is having, or to maybe next time you have a slice of, I don't know, something extra in the day, justify it to other people by saying you're going to go and do X amount of running that evening or something like that. Just being really, really aware that not only is that triggering for people, but actually for yourself as well. It's making it into this terrible thing, and no food should be food that we feel guilty for.
Yeah, both of us, no guilt and no shame. Stop the guilt and shame. There's just so many things. We're not going to get to all of them. We've got questions about, so maybe Caitlin, I'll just give you, so there's another one related to Caitlin's question. What responsibility should we take on fictional media representations of eating disorder? There's another one about mature women and comparing themselves to their past. There's one about how to specialise in addressing eating disorders. So any last words, really, because we're coming to the end. So on any of these.
Yeah, I guess so. Matthew's question around kind of going into eating disorder treatment, working in eating disorders even. I guess I would really, really encourage that. I'm bound to say that, but at the moment, we know that the workforce is massively kind of struggling when it comes to eating disorders. There's kind of basically no dietitians available. There's no nutritionist. There's no psychiatrist available. So I would really, really encourage it. I think it's hard, and again, there's a lot of stigma around working in that space. But actually, if you do it, like, you actually have the chance to save someone's life and get their life back on track. The people that were on my treatment team when I was in hospital quite literally did save my life. And I think it's really important that we focus on those kind of positive stories. I personally would suggest, and I don't want to plan your life for you, although I probably would like to as well. I feel like I personally would go down the NHS route, purely because then actually you can get a real understanding of kind of evaluations, you get understanding of that high level practice. A lot of the time at the moment with eating disorders, we're seeing a lot of private practices kind of popping up left, right and centre, and they're not based on any research. They're not based on kind of outcomes, but actually they're obviously helping people, but they haven't had that evaluation. So starting out in the NHS is a really, really good way of getting that kind of broad range of experience as well. Obviously, you'll have a few more constraints working for the NHS with commissioning and things like that. But like I said, it gives you that broad overview, and then you can work out, I think, kind of where you want to go and what you want to do after that as well. But do feel free to kind of drop me an email, and I can kind of introduce you to people or point you in the right direction as well. And then I think the other thing I'm kind of just quickly kind of with the movie representations and the fictional aspect, I think similarly to the other question around kind of celebs talking about things, I do think there is some level where this can be helpful because it gets people talking about things. But at the same time, it can feel really, really triggering and make people feel like eating disorders are this really fun, glamorous thing to do. So I think in all of these situations, we have to be seeing a much more kind of equal side of things. So looking at the negatives of an eating disorder, like really getting that out there, that's something that we often don't talk about. And we need to be talking about it because it's completely life consuming, not just for the individual, but for their entire family network as well. So I do think a lot needs to be done within that space to make sure that actually stuff is being shared in kind of the appropriate way as well. And then the other question kind of on mature women. Yes, so actually, interestingly, there is quite a bit of research being done at the moment looking at hormonal changes and linking that back to eating disorders too. And we're seeing a lot of kind of women who are going through menopause actually showing those kind of signs and symptoms of an eating disorder as well. So yeah, I think it's important to be mindful of that. I think particularly when you're looking at exercise videos and stuff like that as well. Actually, I think for me it would be maybe about kind of distancing yourself from some of that messaging. I think so often when you kind of hit menopause, you're often told you need to lose a certain amount of weight or need to gain weight, and you're never really doing it right. And then you're kind of judging and comparing to everybody. So it's about creating an environment that works for you. It's about remembering kind of what healthy means to you. And then always remembering, and Heather touched on this earlier, that kind of BMI is such an inaccurate measurement anyway, that actually we need to make sure that actually we really, really understand kind of all of the inaccuracies around that as well. And then again, as soon as you start to feel that maybe you're kind of getting stuck in this habit of needing to do an exercise video or getting your purpose from that, that again then kind of is a red flag that maybe something's not quite right, and maybe that's when you need to have that additional support as well. And if you go to your GP and they kind of fob you off saying it's your menopause, go back again, like keep going back and trying to kind of access that support.
So as a woman of a certain age, thank you for that, Hope. So thank you so much. I can't believe we're out of time. It's flown by. It's been an utter pleasure. Hope you've been an absolute inspiration. I hope very many of you listening will actually take up some of those calls to action that are really important, that we don't just worry about it, we do something about it, because it is possible to change. Culture change is possible. It is possible for us to do differently. And people like Hope are an utter inspiration, and I couldn't have been happier to spend an hour talking to Hope about this. And thank you all for joining. Really appreciate it.
Cool. Thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you all. Thank you.